directly troubling to them, and they're out of the ordinary, and they're potentially menacing, then an answer to what the hell is this and why should I get used to it should be forthcoming. And yet you're told, basically shut up, and you don't have any rights. You'd be committing a terrible felony if you took any action, and we're not going to tell you anything. And move on.
Well, welcome to the new Spencer Leonard Hour. It's probably going to be two, I hope, from front facing and in the Patreon Parrot Room. But I'm very glad to be, I guess, not just supplementing, but adding to our regular Friday Catrone Zones to bring in Spencer Leonard on the regular. Spencer agreed to do this. So, Spencer Leonard, welcome. You're a professor of sociology. When I looked up your bio, but you're also the author or the editor of two books. They are, which came out in 2023, Marx and Engels on Bonapartism, the selected journalism from 1851 to 1859, and then Marx and Engels on imperialism, selected journalism from 1856 to 1862, both out from Lexington Books in 2023. Also, of course, you are one of the bad people behind the Platypus Affiliated Society, inspiring blacklists around the world. And so I'm, of course, very pleased to talk to you again, Spencer, and welcome to your new show.
Oh, my goodness. Do I have a show?
Yeah. Yes, you do.
I have. I would also point out, I guess a lot of my writing has taken, or a lot of my publication has taken the form of editing, that I've also edited the 2 volumes of the Platypus Review Reader.
Right.
Which you do not have to be a member of Platypus to read.
No, and you don't have to be a member of Platypus to read it. You don't even have to be familiar with the Platypus Affiliated Society very deeply to read it. I have the big, thick first volume. I think I need to get the second still. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about Bonapartism.
You gotta read my introduction to the second volume. Definitely.
Okay. Am I mentioned in it? Because that's the only reason I'd want to read it.
I don't think so.
Dang. Oh, well. No. We're going to be talking about Bonapartism and imperialism today. And before we started, you were mentioning that the journalism in your first book on Bonapartism, journalism that Marx wrote as he covered British politics, has been largely ignored, even by the British Marxists, even by the British left. And I guess what I want to start with is, why do you think it is that this work has been ignored so universally?
Oh, there's lots of reasons. For one thing, the idea of British Marxism is fairly dubious in the sense that there was never really a Marxism in Britain. That would be one thing. There was never really a socialist party in Britain. There was liberalism. I mean, I guess there was Chartism, but what's followed since Chartism is another matter. And there are important figures like Hinman, for instance, is an important interlocutor in the Second International, but there isn't a Second International party from the UK. And unlike in the United States, people often say like there's something peculiar about the United States. It never had Marxism. Of course it did. It had the Socialist Party of the United States, led by Eugene Debs, who was a Kautsky Marxist. There's no exact equivalent to that in the UK, and that's indicative of of a wider problem, if you will, of Marxism, that
Mm-hmm.
or, of the Second International, which grows out of 1848 itself, which is that Britain is largely untouched by socialist revolution, uh, even as it is the center of global capitalism. And so I think there's a wound there. Marx talks about it in his writings on 1848. He's very aware of the fact, and this comes up in my introduction to the writings on Britain on Bonapartism, the first volume. These are two volumes about the same thing. There's no, Bonapartism and imperialism are just the same thing for Marx. And there I talk about how Marx and Engels anticipate that Britain in the coming revolution will be in the vanguard. And it turns out that the coming revolution is extremely widespread and extremely dramatic, and yet doesn't really take place in Britain. There's a brief attempt. There's an attempt by the Chartists to present their People's Charter to the House of Commons in April of 1848, and that's basically dispersed and largely just intimidated. And there's nothing else in that period, even though it's hard for us to even conceive of how dominant Britain was in the development of industrial capitalism. Certainly by 1848, Britain is not the exclusive, but the overwhelmingly predominant home of the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of the proletariat. There are other places, but Belgium, parts of France, parts of the Rhineland, in a very incipient way, parts of the American North. But in that period, the social question, the question of the emerging working class and the associated political crisis is a British question. And the working class is developed much more elaborate organizational forms in Britain than elsewhere in the 40s, in a period from 1839 to about 1848. And so Britain is a kind of a wound, right? It's the absence of the revolution. It's the absence of world socialism. It's that problem, right? And I think for a lot of people, 1917 is of course a profound historical experience. But if you're trying to think about world revolution, you can't just start there, because in many ways, 1917, or certainly shortly thereafter, its aftermath, is one of the steady crisis and collapse of socialism in the core of capital. And so 1917 is a high watermark, but it's also the beginning of the end. The project of world revolution coming out of 1917, envisioned by Lenin, not only fails in the immediate aftermath of 1917, but the strategic retreat from it crucially fails, right? So Lenin by 1920 is already arguing that the world revolution has peaked and that it's now time to conduct an orderly retreat and to rebuild on on the basis of the experience of 1917 to 1919. And that retreat, that orderly retreat and reconstitution of an expansion of on a higher historical basis of the world proletarian movement for socialism never happens. So, for instance, a communist party is created in Great Britain as a result of 1917, right? But it never really becomes a force for world socialism, and especially after 1926. So this is, I think the reason, just as I think there's a lot of problems with thinking about, but to a lesser degree, about the history of the American left. These are crucial. Like by 1917, I would certainly say everybody knows America's the center of the capitalist world, and for the rest of the 20th century, of course, that's only more so. So, for instance, Trotskyism basically had a kind of American focus after the rise of Hitler in Europe and the destruction of the European left. Trotsky is, the debates within Trotskyism are in America, but Trotskyism never, it's stillborn as a major political force. So, Marxists don't like, and Stalinism militates against confronting the defeats in its history. And a unmistakable defeat is the failure to build a socialist political party in Britain in the 19th century. And in effect, what people do is they say, well, you couldn't really have had socialism in the 19th century anyway, right? Marx and Engels don't believe that. They are there to make a world revolution, and that is, and they are extremely preoccupied with British developments. I mean, it's where they live, but they are close observers, as is the rest of the European left, of the tribulation, shall we say, of the British working class and their inability to get out from under liberal leadership in the last decades of the 19th century. That's a major issue that's now just submerged and buried. And that was reinforced. I was talking at the, just before we went live about the New Left, people around the New Left Review, like Perry Anderson and Tom Nairn and others. And these people came up with just wildly, implausible notions like Britain never had a bourgeois revolution. Britain is backward. Britain is backward because it's ruled by aristocrats, right? It's semi-feudal until basically until the Labor government after World War II. It's insane, but this is literally what they think and what they say. And so I was complaining to you about how Marx's writings, explicit writings, which are voluminous, which would, there is a Stalinist volume because the Stalinists published a lot of these journalism on a kind of national roads to socialism basis. So they had books on Britain, on France, on America, Marx and Engels on X, on Y, on the other thing, nationally conceived. And so there is a Marx and Engels on Britain book, but it was ill-conceived in its publication, and it had no impact, really to speak.
As an American, I want to know what is missing from the Marxist milieu in America and internationally due to the lack of the British left being able to take up the writings Marx? What is the point of claiming that the UK never had a bourgeois revolution? What is the point of misunderstanding, or what is the effect of misunderstanding this history and ignoring the writings of Marx around the Chartist movement? And
I mean, there are a lot of different ways I could take that. I mean, one thing that I focus on in the book, the purpose of the books is, in a sense, there's an argument, but I haven't written an argument. I mean, I have introductions, but I've edited Marx. Right, that's a decision, of course.
Mm-hmm. Right,
and what I've tried to do is to show, in effect, what I'm saying is, okay, look at this body of journalism. It's available to everybody. It's, whatever it is, volumes 11 through 19, 18 of Marx and Engels' collected works in English. There's other stuff mixed in, but it's the great majority of it. It's about 4,000 or 5,000 pages. I have selected from that, and I have selected what I think are, the best of it. But of course, I also have selected what I think is representative. And putting it together, I am challenging readers to confront the fact that Marx and Engels were developing the ideas that they first alight upon, that they first begin to conceptualize out of the experience of the Revolution of 1848, about what capitalism is as a political problem, which is related to how they conceive of state and civil society relations in the context of capital. In other words, the problem of imperialism, or Bonapartism, that Marx famously analyzes in, above all, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and in a kind of retrospective way in Marx's writings on the Commune, the Civil War in France, where Marx gives a kind of history of the Second Empire. These are famous writings, and they're well known. And what I've argued is, look, this isn't about the peculiarities of Louis Bonaparte's regime, right? Louis Bonaparte's regime typifies a world historic or epochal development, right? Mm-hmm. That the category of imperialism is a political counterpart to the category of capital. And it is those two concepts are both substantially transformed as a function of Marx and Engels' experience in the Revolution of 1848. That this is that Marx and Engels aren't like, I don't know, Heidegger or something. Mm-hmm. They don't just have a turn in their thought. They have an experience which they digest. They have the fundamental experience of the rise of socialism in the 1840s, which is accompanied by the development of mass political parties for working class power, Chartism. It's accompanied by left political economy, or left Ricardian political economy. It's accompanied by French socialism of various sorts. Above all, Proudhon is an object for Marx, and it's accompanied by young Hegelianism. And that's an occasion for Marx and Engels' fundamental understanding that they can't simply advance the old liberal project. That the liberal that the bourgeois revolutionary project is in a kind of crisis. And the phrase that I always use for this, Chris Cattrone first found this in Louis Menon, who's just a writer for the New Yorker, for God's sakes. But everyone has insights from time to time, or is capable of them. And he wrote an introduction to Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station, his history of socialism, in which he calls Marx and Engels philosophers of a second enlightenment. I like that phrase. They recognize that they can't simply be heirs to Hegel, be heirs to the Abbé Sieyès, to Thomas Jefferson, to Adam Smith. But what that means is transformed politically through the experience of the revolution, right? And the problem of democracy becomes to be much more central, right? In the Revolution of 1848, Marx's journal is just called the organ of democracy, right? Or an organ of democracy. Or you might translate it, an organ of the democracy. That's not the way they're going to put it later. And they're going to make crucial developments like the notion of class independence, et cetera, et cetera. So this journalism, these thousands of pages of material, I'm arguing, is a sustained development, albeit in the bourgeois press, or the soft socialist press, this Fourierist newspaper in New York City, the New York Tribune, of the thought of imperialism, because in fact, all of Marx's and Engels's writings are developments of their thinking about imperialism. Now, to get to your question, if it's not just about dictators like Louis Bonaparte, right? What does that look like? Well, Marx lays it out. He's really developing this thought with respect to parliamentary democracy in Great Britain. And these are writings that, they are extremely obscure for Marxists, as we just addressed. But in them, Marx and Engels, they're not like just pointing out parallels, right? They're really developing it out of an ongoing, and this is, you can ask yourself is like, why did Marx and Engels not write like a treatise on the state, or not write a treatise on Bonapartism? Like, why do they write the way they do, right? Because they write like imminent to events. So, you get an education, you get, a masterclass education in the political history of the 19th century when you read this stuff, right? Like, who knows anything about the Revolution of 1848 apart from reading Marx? Nobody does. It's the reason anybody cares. I like there was a biography of Marx by Jonathan Sperber. Who was Jonathan Sperber? He was a historian of the Revolution of 1848. At the end of his life, he's like, well, fuck, I guess I have to write a biography of Marx. Right? That's the only reason anybody knows about the Revolution of 1848. And so Marx's 18th Brumaire is hard to read for this reason, because you have to, obviously students will always be like, well, what do I read about the Revolution of 1848 so I can understand the 18th Brumaire? And of course, I always say, well, read the 18th Brumaire 3 more times, and then you can read, whatever you want to read. Like it's all in Marx, right? Like, and no historian of 1848 challenges Marx's history. But similarly, there's, Marx carries on in exile in this period of counter-revolution. Because Bonapartism, is immediately experienced as counter-revolution, right? It's experienced as the fall of the Republic in France. It's the unmistakable end. Marx and Engels thought that the revolution was over before that, in fact, but they thought the revolution was over in 1850, and they stopped engaging in like revolutionary activity. But it's over for sure to everybody with Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat and the fall of the Republic. And they are in exile and starving, both of them, desperate. And Marx goes to work, and he writes for this newspaper, creating, giving himself the opportunity to digest event by event, day by day, over the course of a decade, the unfolding consolidation, spread, etc., of a global Bonapartist state order. And within the British context, it's, on the one hand, it's interesting because it's a limited democratic environment. It's not universal suffrage. It's not like France in the Revolution, or indeed in the Empire, because Louis Bonaparte, is the great defender of universal suffrage. That's how he justifies his coup d'etat, in fact. But it's democratic, and it's parliamentary, and it's quote unquote liberal, and it has divisions of, it has separations of powers. And in that sense, it's extremely interesting because it doesn't have a presidency, right? And so how can there be Bonapartism, right? The monarch is obviously not a Bonapartist figure, right? So how does that develop? And so it's an analysis of the development of ministerial government, right? What's the difference between the ministry and the party in parliament, right? And the key figure for this, for Marx, is a politician named Lord Palmerston. And so he from the 1852 election through the renewal of the East India Company Charter in 1853, through crucially the Crimean War, the great conflict of the age, through to Italian reunification in the late 50s, and finally the struggle to bring, the attempt by Palmerston's government through the Second Opium War and the subjugation of the Indian Revolt of 1857, and finally the debates around the American Civil War and Britain's attempt to come into that war on the side of the Confederacy. There's a very elaborate engagement with the collapse and crisis of British liberalism, above, as expressed by people like John Bright and Richard Cobden, the great Manchester liberals of the age, and the formation ultimately in 1859 of the Liberal Party that dominates the rest of the century. that we associate with Gladstone in the late 19th century, but it's formed under Palmerston in 59. That entire arc of events is very closely engaged by Marx. And it's so it's a party political environment, it's a parliamentary environment, it's an environment with separations of powers, all of these things that most Marxists will tell you is not Bonapartism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Of course, Palmerston accepts electoral defeat. Right? He's not like a fascist figure. Right? He's not like founding, an empire in which he's meant to lead for the rest of his life. Right? So he's not a Louis Bonaparte kind of figure. He's not a fascist type figure, but he is, for Marx, exemplary of Bonapartist politics. This has never really been dealt with within the literature, and so that's
what marks it as Bonapartist politics.
Well, I mean, for one thing, a lot of things do. It's an open, it's the emergence of like modern demagogy.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there wasn't demagogy before. There's classical demagogy, of course, like Pericles. There's, of course, bourgeois demagogy. But, bourgeois demagogy was, it's not, I mean, is George III demagogic, or Lord North, the prime minister who fought the American Revolution, or William Pitt the Younger, who largely led the British in the wars against France, against the French Revolution and Napoleon. These people aren't really like rallying the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their argument, the struggle against them looked like a struggle for democracy and a struggle for bourgeois right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It looked like a struggle. It looked like the struggle to renew the bourgeois revolution. Palmerston appeals directly to the people. Right. He's he makes jingoistic appeals to the people. He also openly flouts Parliament's prerogatives, most crucially to, for instance, declare war. Right? He takes decisions to declare war on his own. In part, that looks like extensions of old problems, like the East India Company declaring war because it's not exactly the government. But Palmerston starts using Indian troops and British troops in Asia as if he was fighting Indian wars. In other words, without recourse to Parliament. He does so in Persia and in China. And he is doctoring, this sounds very familiar. When Parliament demands documents, like the blue books, what the British would call blue books, like the documents that were delivered to Parliament for review, are cooked. Just like a congressional committee today cannot get the government to cough up its documents, right? So that he's a figure of the he represents the autonomy of the state and what we might call the deep state or the bureaucracy. He is also a man of all seasons. Right. So Louis Bonaparte is a proletarian politician. He's a bourgeois politician. He's a petty bourgeois politician. Right. He makes appeals to everyone and no one. Right. Marx has this wonderful image in the 18th Brumaire that Louis Bonaparte wants to steal all of France so he can give it back as his own gift. So that, right. So he can appease this group, and he can appease that group, and he can appease the third group, but everyone is dependent upon Louis Bonaparte.
Right.
Marx calls it imperial socialism elsewhere in these volumes. A very useful category. And Palmerston is like that. Palmerston is in his own history. He's a Tory. He's a Whig. He's an aristocrat. He's a man of the people. Right. So, and Marx writes a whole book on it, which is going to be, right. I'm working on a third volume. And included in that will be Marx's 8-part series on the life of Palmerston, where he talks about and so Paul. The last thing I'll say, I know I'm being long-winded. The last thing I'll say is that Palmerston he's a figure of foreign policy. He's a foreign minister. He takes that portfolio, as the British would say, and Marx describes his foreign policy as, Lord Palmerston conducts world events for his own private pleasure, which is to say, he manipulates the press. First of all, he buys off the press. There's a whole Palmerstonian press that Marx loves to talk about, how he manipulates, how he plants stories, right? How he uses, foreign crises. He creates, he fearmongers about the military and war, right? And he gins war hysteria. And then he's the indispensable man to create peace, right? That's the analysis of Palmerston.
Yeah. So, listening to you describe Palmerston, I couldn't help but think about this last election, and the way in which both parties engaged in demagoguery, and both parties represented themselves differently to different demographics. Although I would say Kamala Harris did that a bit more than Trump did, because Trump's just incapable of really shifting gears that much. But I was struck in the last election by how little of what was debated and discussed and claimed had any bearing on reality. An example would be the way Kamala Harris talked about abortion rights, where she would claim, they're going to take away your abortion rights, although that had really, in some sense, already happened with the overturning of Roe versus Wade in some places, right? And then also make wild claims about how even surgical procedures around miscarriages were at risk, which was a kind of fear mongering. All the while, in reality, only planning on fighting through the state level to change the laws to extend the right to.
The most obvious examples are abortion and immigration, right? These are old, familiar examples of demagoguing, of the demagoguing of these questions in a way that grind up a lot of people, right? A lot of people get caught up in the gears of, right? Because, people believe their own bullshit. Right. The Republicans believe their bullshit about abortion. Right. And they start trying to actually limit it. And then they realize this is really not a winning issue. We were just playing to a constituency, and we can't let ourselves get carried away. That happened in the election, right? With Trump trying to finesse the abortion issue.
He not only did he try to, he succeeded in finessing the abortions. Yeah,
he did. He may even have laid it to rest, we can hope. Right. That's where, he would say like, well, everyone is happy, right? That it like the issue is with the states,
Right.
right? That's not really true, but I do think that in the end, there's a majority in every state for
everyone, meaning both parties, had agreed that the issue was really going to be fought out at the level of the states. That whether or not everyone was happy is a separate issue, but I don't think the Democrats had any plans to.
Well, the Democrats were upset about the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Right, they were upset about it, but I mean, it had happened, and so now there had been a mutual agreement, on some level, that this was going to be contested on the level of the states, and that was no federal battle was going to be forthcoming to either establish abortion rights federally or overturn them federally. That was not in the cards. Simply was not in the cards, and
right.
Everyone knew that.
And so we've seen a lot of ballot splitting in recent elections, around this issue, because people not only, are reconciled to, a woman's right to access abortion, but they are willing to think about it politically to the degree that they'll actually split their votes, right? Mm-hmm. And that was signaled all the way back in the Kansas referendum, right? There have been referendum across the country, right, where this issue consistently wins. Even as Republicans are winning elections, right? And similarly, and you and Chris talked about this, I think, in your recent discussion. Trump is caught on the horns of his own. He's hoist on his own petard around immigration, because obviously he's going to betray people who think that he's going to completely eliminate immigration. That's not
yeah, of course. That I mean, I don't know why anyone thought that was going to happen, but yeah, the
larger question of like who, like you were saying that like both candidates were like remarkably vague, and the debate was like astoundingly lame. But of course, there's also all of the interviews and everything that's taking place on the web, especially if you're paying attention to Trump World, right? Because Trump World really, Trump's campaign really was not televised, and that, this electoral revolution wasn't televised. It was live streamed. It was podcast. And there, and not only from Trump, but from, innumerable surrogates, there was a sustained attack on the deep state. There was a sustained attack on violations of civil rights, of censorship, et cetera. There was a sustained attack on the corruption of the medical establishment, in the kind of lash up between big pharma and the government, et cetera. Just as on the Democrat side, there's a attack that Trump is like a dictator. Trump doesn't accept liberal norms. Trump isn't going to, there won't be another election, right? So everyone's accusing the other side of violating, in essence, the law, of being, of instituting a permanent state of exception. And that is to say, they're accusing each other of being Bonapartist. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I want to know. No, it's good. When I was reading the first article from the New York Tribune, it's August 21st, 25th, and September 4th are the ones that you selected, but I was reading the one from August 21st. Another thing that struck me was that he's describing the hollowing out of the political parties in the UK, and the way in which they each kind of represent certain interests, or use propaganda to make claims to political power, but without actually already having abandoned what had defined the parties before. So, like the Tories are now okay with the repeal of the Corn Laws, as an example.
Right.
And the major claim, I'm not sure, I think it was the Whigs, perhaps, that attempted to make a claim for their right to have political power based on their expert ability to govern and their merit that they had as a class. And it made me think about this last election and how one of the claims that the progressive Democrats would make is exactly that they were the adults, they had the skills and the understanding to be able to govern. But in today's context, that means they had experience within the federal bureaucracies, meaning different agencies, and the expert knowledge that would go along with it, whether it would be in terms of monitoring food production or dealing with labor relations or working on transportation or whatever it might be, whichever agency it might be that they were going to fill. I wondered about, in the 19th century, what it looks like when I'm reading this, that the parties themselves are filling those positions in the government rather than some second or third agency, which would then be populated by the politicians' appointees. But what I'm wondering is, what was the structure of what I'll call the administrative state or the Bonapartist state then as compared to now? And are we further along in the development of Bonapartism?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. This is, the issue with the British, and I raise this, is like obviously everything's much more gradual. And less clearly demarcated and less dramatically demarcated than it is in the context of the dynamics of the European Revolution in 1848. And this is in Britain's history is further complicated by the fact that it's bourgeois and it's a country that, of course, has had a very significant bourgeois revolution. But that revolution seemed to already be betrayed, or like when did the British?
You definitely get that sense reading just the first article here on the election in England. The bourgeois, not only is the bourgeois revolution betrayed, but even the aristocrats have betrayed their principles and their political project, according to Marx.
Right. So the British have already fought against, American independence, but really the fight against American independence was a counter-revolution in Britain. What happened to a few million people out on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean really is not as important as the subordination of British democracy, of the British democratic movement. There was a crisis of overrepresentation in Britain. And I talk about this, that the argument for universal suffrage had already arisen in 1776, articulated by a figure named Major Cartwright, a radical patriot Whig, right? That's where the word patriot comes from in the American Revolution, right? Is that these were supporters, radicals who were supporters of a kind of advancing and consolidating on a higher plane of the bourgeois revolution. That's what patriot Whig meant, right? It meant we needed need to take the Whig Revolution of 1688 and consolidate it on a 18th century basis. We need to advance it constitutionally. And so the Americans were just a part of that movement, and it ended up being a kind of a localized war for independence. Independence was always a kind of a consolation prize. The main prize was an empire-wide revolution. Figures like Adam Smith are arguing for that, right? Explicit in The Wealth of Nations. And they're arguing for a revolution that centers in Britain and expands across the empire. That's defeated, and then the Whig, indeed the very son of the great, another way of defining a patriot Whig is just a supporter of William Pitt the Elder, the man after whom the city in Pennsylvania is named, Pittsburgh. He was all the American founding fathers would have considered themselves followers of William Pitt the Elder, but it's his son that is the parliamentary leader in the age of the anti-French Revolutionary Wars, William Pitt the Younger, right? So there's a deep crisis of Whiggery and a rebirth of Toryism in the 18th century. And that in a sense slow counter-revolution is never really undone, so that most British people don't think that they ever had a revolution, right? If you ask, like compared to Americans, right? Americans like celebrate 4th of July, like we had a revolution. It was in 1776. We know the chief document, the Declaration of Independence. The British don't have this, right? You have to be a kind of highly, ideologically overwrought Britain to even know about these things, right? To take seriously the idea that you have a constitution, right? All of those, that you have a Bill of Rights, right? There was a Bill of Rights in 1688, that King William had to agree to before he was granted the throne of England in that revolution. But most British people don't know about that because their history's, deeply discombobulated, and it is sort of it is turned into this revolution proof. Like the British have the most savvy ruling class, right? You'll hear leftists say this, right? They have a ruling class that can adjust at every point so as to avoid revolution. Marx is pointing out, he's looking at it from the point of view of, okay, there was this long counter-revolutionary night from 1776 through the Battle of Waterloo and something called the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, which Percy B. Shelley writes The Mask of Anarchy about, if you've ever read that wonderful poem. A classic piece of radical English literature. The Whigs make a comeback in order to reform the representation question finally in the late 20s, and ultimately 1832 it's passed. And there is a huge nationwide agitation around this question of the reform bill. And it's ultimately a fairly modest measure, but it takes place in the context of sort of all of the discontent of the British people over the last half century really finding voice. In France, there's the overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy, right, with the July Revolution. And in Britain, there's this great reform bill agitation that the Whigs really are defined by. And so they kind of re-burnish their credentials as a revolutionary party, even though this bill is not all that it could be. It's out of the discontent with that bill that Chartism is born, right, in the 1830s, which is precisely about like the terms of the reform bill, the terms of representation. That's all that the charter is about. And so what Marx is saying in the 1850s is that it looked like the parties like had a logic. It it might have been like lost in a period of counter-revolution, but the 19th century liberalism came back, the high liberalism of the 1820s, the age of Hegel and Ricardo, and what in English lit class is called Romanticism, but is not always, is often high liberal, like Shelley. And now these parties have lost like any sense of their purpose, right? Why? Because the only real question is the question of socialism, right? The only real question is posed by the Revolution of 1848 and Chartism. And that saps the capacity of the bourgeoisie to advance its project any further. Right? The bourgeoisie ceases to be revolutionary, is the way that the traditional Marxism will put it. Right? Which isn't really about the bourgeoisie as a class. It's about liberalism as an ideological horizon. And Marx this is what Marx is all about, right? Is the crisis of liberalism. The crisis of bourgeois revolution. And so it's in that context that you get this kind of ministerial government, the ministry of all the talents.
Right? Yeah, that was the phrase I was trying to remember, the minister of the talents. That sounds exactly like the progressive state today.
RFK, Vivek Ramaswamy,
Trump, that too.
Tulsi Gabbard, right? Like we're going to draw all the best from the Democrats, right? This is the
but the Democrats themselves would claim all those people are hacks and they're amateurs and they're not talented and they're not experts. They know nothing. They know nothing. Some maybe, and that we have all the talent on our side, but we're so talented we don't even want you to know who we are, and you certainly can't question us.
Really, what's important is that the Democrats look clownish just because neoliberalism is exhausted, right? Like what had been expertise now looks like foolishness or it's out of touch, and the index of it, or the telltale sign, is that they want increased government secrecy, right? That they're less capable of defending these positions in public. So it's not that the people are bad. Like what's important about the Republicans is simply that they let the crisis happen. Like what you see with like these H-1B debates and all of this stuff, it just is the debate that America has to have, and it's going to happen on Trump grounds, not on the Democrats' grounds, because the Democrats don't allow a debate. Right? Trump doesn't really represent anything clearly. I mean, he does. He has certain preoccupations, but what he really is an opportunity to fundamentally recalibrate And the Democrats just weren't going to let that happen. And Kamala Harris, to me, just sort of typified that, that she was just joy. Like what a crazy, like the politics of joy, right? Like it was really just like, let's just dance and clap at how wonderful our bureaucrats are.
Well, the other slogan that struck me was, "We're not going back," which right. Which was supposed to be read like, we're not going back to the 50s. We're not going to lose women's rights. We're not going back to a more repressive time. That's what it was meant to be heard as saying. But I read it as saying, we're not going to think again. We are not going to change course. We're going to continue forward exactly as we've been going, in the direction we've been going. There's no shifting the ground here. There's no reconsideration. And that was rejected. That, at the ballot box, that was rejected.
I think that, what prompted Trump to run was the pusillanimity of Mitt Romney. Right? Mitt Romney was just so weak and feckless that I think that inspired Trump to run. He realized how weak the Republican Party was and how unfit for purpose. And what was significant about that? Right? In other words, what might Trump want? Trump does want to go back, right? One thing he definitely wants to go back to is some of the Obama era changes, like, Title IX, right? Like where feminism just becomes this horrible bureaucratic monstrosity, right? That is weaponized against young men, in college and the like. It was further developed under Biden into these impossible, trans innovations that were, they're impossible because it's just it's obvious that that it can't be defended. You can't defend having, men play contact sports with women. Right, it's just an obvious going back on the division between men and women's sports, and they're just sort of caught in their own ideology. Like girls are going to get hurt in volleyball or but eventually they are, right? If you take it to soccer or something, right? People are going to get hurt. It was all silly.
But the point here to get out of the details on
conducting war and conducting immigration without reference to public debate, right? You and Chris were talking about this, like the bureaucrats saying like we know best, and Trump insisting on like opening the questions, right, and like that is really the crime of Trump. I think of like they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs that way. Trump was just going to, people saying you can't say that for Trump is just, you can't debate the immigration issue. Right? Like he's going to get up there and say they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. Like he's going to say the craziest shit. Right? He's going to violate whatever taboo in order to say like, look, we have to be able to fucking discuss what's going on in small town Ohio. Right? We have to represent the people's concerns. And obviously the Democrats are like, no, we don't. Like, no good can come of that. These are a bunch of crazy, fentanyl addicted rednecks. And, we do need these Haitian immigrants. And I can tell you 10 reasons why. And, one of the things that Chris said is like, look, I'm sympathetic to the bureaucrats, because the form that it takes, obviously, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs is about as demagogic as it could possibly be. Just total insanity, right? And Vance and he were going to quote unquote double down on it, because they were going to say, like, no, we have to debate the Ukraine war, we have to debate the immigration policies, right? All of this stuff. Yeah.
But now Elon Musk is saying he's going to throttle negativity on X, and he wants a more positive atmosphere on what was Twitter as Trump's coming into office. So criticism and debate, which involves negativity, is going to be pulled back a bit as Trump takes office, and the debates about immigration that are happening now, all of these things are symptoms of the fact that what set up the Bonapartist state hasn't been addressed. It's not like Trump is going to be coming along. As you pointed out, these are the talents of the experts that are being brought in to manage. And democracy means selecting these kinds of people rather than developing an independent project.
I mean, obviously, like, Trump has been incredible at assembling a new governing class, and that's like really much clearer now than in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And what's at stake in these appointment confirmation hearings is whether at least the Republicans are going to consolidate around him, are going to rally around Trump to say, like, yes, Tulsi Gabbard represents the new expertise.
Right. And what I am trying in various ways to push is the idea that if there were to be a left, if there wasn't so dead, the left would be advocating for someone like Kash Patel or Tulsi Gabbard with the intention of at least witnessing when they don't live up to the hype, when the projects that they're claiming they're going to undertake are missed, or because we ought to want the deep state, the intelligence community, to have a major house cleaning and for a lot of the direct to be exposed. The socialist left ought to want something like the Church Committee, but on maybe even on a grander scale. And instead, most of the left is being called upon to oppose the very kinds of mechanisms that would maybe allow for an opening up in our politics, however short that window might be.
Right. So you and Chris talked about Christian Parenti, I guess it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he wrote for Compact about Kash Patel.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily say I support Kash Patel, but I would oppose the or do what Parenti did. I mean, it's a good piece, which is basically to say, like, look, you can't be on the side of defending the FBI. I mean, the problem with advocating for Kash Patel is that eventually you're going to be advocating
on the side of FBI again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the contradictoriness of the Democrats' position, right, is manifest. It's plain to see. I mean, even the leftists like Parenti can see it. So I think that there's going to be an abundant like, it's very sad that there isn't a socialism. Right here, you have a crisis of the capitalist parties, as a result of which all sorts of things are going to get said. Right, like a lot of things got said during the Church Committee hearings. Right, reading those reports, to this day is a big education. Right, that sustained, decades of intellectual writing, of intellectual life, right? Like digesting the church committee hearings and all of their implications, has produced thousands of books, including shelves and shelves of leftist stuff, right, about the deep state and the dirty tricks and COINTELPRO and what was done in Vietnam and on, and how the public was deceived, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the sad thing is that it's going to be, and this is what we were talking about before we started recording, the left isn't interested in all of the educational opportunities that capitalist politics can be made to yield. Like we were talking about the Podesta emails, when Julian Assange leaked on Wikipedia, the Guccifer or whatever, whoever the hacker was supposed to be, right? And he was an evil Russian in Moscow who had done this on behalf of Trump, and it's like, well, whatever, right? Because obviously our political parties are capitalist. They are not transparent civil society associations that have debates according to Robert's Rules of Order, that have clear and transparent democracy within them, right? Like, people get upset about the lack of democracy amongst leftist parties or communist parties in the 20th century. I mean, there's no democracy in the Democratic Party. God knows. Stalin would, is jealous of the kind of control that Clinton and Obama have in the Democratic Party. No one has any idea how things are manipulated. Really, how was Biden made to step down? Really, really, how was Biden ushered into the nomination in South Carolina in 2020? What was Buttigieg promised? How was Elizabeth Warren convinced to stay in the race, to divide the vote with Bernie? Right? All of these things, right? It's utterly opaque. It's like trying to pry into the secrets of the state. Why? Because it actually is trying to pry into the secrets of the state. Because these parties are so deeply interfused with the state in the way that, of course, civil society as a whole is. And the project of socialists, to try to revitalize civil society as a civil, ultimately as a project of building a civil society institution, a socialist party that's independent of capitalist politics, right? Immense education about the necessity for that could have been conducted by leftists, but instead, all of the millennials, because whose job was it? It was the people who became the DSA left, right? Like their job was to expose they were Bernie-crats, for crying out loud. You'd think that their very experience would have led them to it, but instead they were turned into anti-Trump hysterics, and they have very little to show for themselves. Like they talk about like class independence, class unity, and MUG and these different formations within DSA, but they're completely workerist. They don't talk about questions that relate to society and politics as a whole.
Right. No, and now they're completely anti-imperialist.
The Podesta emails, why not?
Yeah. Listen, we've been talking for over an hour. I'm going to go refill my coffee cup. We'll have a parrot room in just a minute. I'll send you another link.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.